Why this fairy tale was more horrifying than you ever imagined. You think you know the story. A golden-haired girl, a glass slipper, a midnight transformation that breaks like morning light. But what if I told you that the fairy tale you grew up with was a lie? That beneath the Disney magic and happily ever after lies something far more sinister than your darkest nightmares could conjure? Welcome to the rotten past. Tonight, we're peeling back the blood-soaked pages of history to reveal the true horror that inspired our most beloved children's stories. This isn't just about fairy tales. This is about survival. This is about what humans become when civilization crumbles and hunger gnaws at their bones. Picture medieval Europe in the early 1800s. Two brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, are hunched over flickering candlelight in their cramped quarters, recording stories that have been whispered from generation to generation. But these aren't the sanitized bedtime stories you remember. These are testimonies of terror, carved from centuries of human suffering. The Grimm brothers weren't writing for children. They were preserving the dark soul of German culture, collecting tales that reflected the brutal realities of medieval life. Stories born from famines so devastating that parents made choices no parent should ever make. Stories where the line between victim and monster blurred until it disappeared entirely. Let me take you back to the original Cinderella, not the Disney princess in her ball gown, but Aschenputtel, a name that translates to ash fool. Picture this. Her stepsisters, desperate to marry the prince, take a knife to their own feet. The first sister slices off her big toe. Blood pools in the golden slipper, but she smiles through the agony. The second sister cuts away her heel, the blade scraping bone as she forces her mutilated foot into the shoe. The prince, somehow blind to the crimson trail they leave behind, loads each bleeding woman into his carriage. It's only when magical birds begin singing a warning song that he looks down and sees the truth. His carriage floor is awash with blood, but the horror doesn't end there. When Cinderella finally marries her prince, her stepsisters attend the wedding, still hoping for reflected glory. As the couple walks down the aisle, white doves descend from the trees. One by one, they peck out the stepsisters' eyes. First one eye, then the other. The women who cut their bodies for a crown are left blind, stumbling in eternal darkness. This isn't creative embellishment. This is what the Grimm brothers recorded as authentic folklore, passed down through generations of German peasants who understood that survival often demanded unspeakable choices. But Cinderella's blood-soaked slippers pale in comparison to what inspired perhaps the most horrifying tale of all, Hansel and Gretel. The year is 1315. Across Europe, the Great Famine has begun. For 2 years, unrelenting rains will destroy crops, rot grain in the fields, and plunge an entire continent into starvation. This isn't just hunger. This is the complete collapse of the food chain that sustained medieval civilization. In Germany, families huddle in their homes as winter extends its icy grip well into what should be spring. Food stores dwindle to nothing. Desperate parents boil tree bark, grind acorns into flour, and feed their children grass soup that provides no nutrition, only the illusion of a full stomach. And then comes the choice no parent should ever face. Records from this period paint a picture so devastating that modern historians still debate whether to believe them. An Estonian chronicle from 1315 states matter-of-factly, mothers were fed their children. An Irish chronicler wrote that people extracted bodies of the dead from cemeteries and dug out the flesh from the skulls and ate it, and women ate their children out of hunger. This is the world that birthed Hansel and Gretel. Not a charming story about a gingerbread house, but a testimony to what happens when civilization strips away and reveals the animal beneath the human skin. In the original Grimm version, there is no wicked stepmother. There are simply parents, biological parents, who can no longer feed their children. The mother, practical and cold, convinces the father that their only hope for survival is to abandon Hansel and Gretel in the forest. Better that wild animals should kill them quickly than that the entire family should starve slowly. The father protests, but hunger has a way of eroding moral certainties. He agrees. Twice they lead their children into the woods. Twice they leave them to die. The second time, when Hansel's trail of breadcrumbs is devoured by birds, the children truly become lost. For 3 days they wander, growing weaker, until they stumble upon something impossible, a house made entirely of candy. But here's what Disney never told you. That house isn't magical. It's bait. The witch who lives there understands the desperation of starving children. She builds her house from the very thing they crave most: sweetness, abundance, the promise of a full belly. She knows they'll tear at the walls with their bare hands, stuffing sugar and gingerbread into their mouths until they're sick. And then she captures them. The witch's plan is methodical, practiced. She locks Hansel in a cage and begins to fatten him like livestock. Every day she feeds him the finest foods while Gretel scrubs floors and tends the fire. Every day, the witch pinches Hansel's finger to test how much weight he's gained. When he's plump enough, she'll roast him alive and feast on his tender flesh. This isn't a metaphor. This isn't symbolism. In the world that created this story, cannibalism wasn't the stuff of nightmares. It was a survival strategy. Think about it. Who would know exactly how to fatten a child for eating? Who would have the practical knowledge of cooking times and preparation methods? Someone who had done it before. Someone who had crossed that final moral boundary and discovered they could live with themselves afterward. The witch in Hansel and Gretel isn't a supernatural monster. She's a human being who made the same choice as countless others during those plague years: to survive at any cost. When Gretel finally tricks the witch into her own oven, shoving her into the flames where she burns alive, it's not a triumph of good over evil. It's one killer destroying another. Children forced to become murderers because the adults who should have protected them failed. And here's the detail that will haunt your dreams. In the original version, when Hansel and Gretel finally return home, they discover that their mother has died. Some scholars believe this is no coincidence. They theorize that the mother and the witch are the same character, that the woman who abandoned her children to starve became, in their trauma-scarred minds, the monster who tried to devour them. The psychological horror runs even deeper. These stories weren't cautionary tales about stranger danger. They were processing mechanisms for real trauma. Children who survived the Great Famine would have witnessed starvation, abandonment, and yes, cannibalism. They would have seen their neighbors become monsters. They would have learned that parents, when pushed to their breaking point, could make choices that defied every natural instinct. So when these children grew up and told stories to their own offspring, they created narratives that helped them process the unprocessable. They wrapped their deepest fears in the language of magic and fantasy, creating psychological distance from memories too raw to confront directly. The brothers Grimm, collecting these stories 3 centuries later, understood they were preserving more than entertainment. They were documenting humanity's capacity for both unfathomable cruelty and impossible survival. They were showing that sometimes the real monsters aren't supernatural creatures lurking in dark forests. Sometimes, the monsters are us. When Wilhelm Grimm later edited these stories to make them more suitable for children, he made a telling change. In later editions, the biological mother who abandons Hansel and Gretel becomes a stepmother. The message was clear: real mothers don't abandon their children. Only evil stepmothers commit such atrocities. But the original storytellers knew better. They understood that under the right circumstances, when faced with watching your entire family starve to death, even the most loving parent might make the unthinkable choice. This is what makes the true Grimm fairy tales so deeply disturbing. They don't reassure us that evil is easily identifiable, that monsters have fangs and claws and live in distant castles. Instead, they whisper a more terrifying truth, that the capacity for monstrous acts lives inside all of us, waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. In medieval Europe, those circumstances weren't rare or extraordinary. They were cyclical, predictable. Every few decades, crop failure or plague or war would strip away the thin veneer of civilization and reveal what humans become when survival is no longer guaranteed. The fairy tales we sanitized and Disneyfied were originally survival manuals, passed down through generations of people who had lived through humanity's darkest hours. They were instructions for recognizing when the world was about to collapse, and for understanding that in such times, the normal rules no longer apply. Tonight, as you tuck your children into bed with their picture books full of singing mice and fairy godmothers, remember this: the stories that became their bedtime tales were once the nightmares of children who lived through real horror. Children who knew that sometimes mothers abandon their young, that sometimes neighbors become cannibals, that sometimes the only way to survive is to become the very monster you most fear. The brothers Grimm preserved these stories not to terrify future generations, but to ensure we never forget what we're capable of when civilization fails. They understood that the real horror isn't in the fantastic elements, the magic mirrors, the talking animals, the houses made of candy. The real horror is in the recognition that these stories, stripped of their magical elements, aren't fantasy at all. They're history. And history, as they say, has a way of repeating itself. The next time you hear a fairy tale, listen carefully to what it's really saying. Because beneath every happily ever after lies a truth too terrible to speak aloud, except in whispers, passed from one generation to the next, wrapped in the protective language of once upon a time. Some truths are too dark for daylight, but in the shadows of story, they endure forever.